Hello, and thank you for joining us for Earth Safe Canada's speaker series. I'm Carrie from Earth Safe Canada, and I am pleased to be joined today by Brenda Davis. Brenda is joining us from Calgary, and she will be addressing the issue of the role of plant-based diets in the battle against chronic disease. Thank you so much for joining us today, Brenda.
Well, thank you so much for the beautiful introduction, Carrie. I'm so happy to be here.
Well, thank you.
I'm just wondering if people are getting in.
Yes, and thank you for mentioning that. We really do apologize. We've had some technical issues and setting up, so we're running a little bit late, and hopefully people have a little bit of extra time after 5 o'clock to finish the presentation with us and ask some questions. All right, a little bit about Brenda before we go forward. Brenda is a registered dietitian, and she's actually an internationally acclaimed speaker. She's been a speaker at medical, nutrition, and dietetic conferences in 25 countries on 6 continents. She's also a prolific writer. She has co-authored 13 books on nutrition with nearly 1 million copies in print and in 12 languages. Her latest book, which is in my library, Plant-Powered Protein, was released last year. And she's also authored and co-authored many professional and lay articles, and is a past chair of the Vegetarian Nutrition Dietetic Practice Group of the Academy of Nutrition Dietetics. That's a long, long group name. She was a lead dietitian in diabetes intervention research in the Marshall Islands, and she was the 7th recipient of the Plantations Project's Luminary Award in 2022 and was inducted to the Vegetarian Hall of Fame in 2007. Truly a plant-based trailblazer and a bit of a rock star here. So a few little admin things before we hand over to Brenda. Brenda's going to be speaking 45 to 50 minutes, which will leave us 10 to 15 minutes for questions. If you're joining us live, please post your questions through Facebook or YouTube. And anyone that posts either question or comment will be entered into a draw for one of 2 $25 gift cards from Vegan Supply, which they've graciously donated for this speaker series. And that's it for the admin, and over to Brenda.
Oh, well, thanks so much, Carrie. I'm really excited to be here, and I am going to share my screen. Just a second. There we go. So I'll get started right away because I know we're running a little bit late. Today I'm going to be talking about plant-based diets in the prevention and treatment of chronic disease. And I'll start with a quick outline. We're going to begin by talking about the shift towards plant-based dietary guidelines that are advocating for more plant-predominant diets, both nationally and internationally. And then we'll move on to talk a little bit about the evidence that plant-based diets afford protection. And then I'm excited to share just a little bit about my personal experience in putting lifestyle medicine into practice, and we'll talk about some of those things. And then the remainder of the presentation will be sort of our practical piece, where we'll talk about 7 steps to an optimal diet for disease prevention and treatment. And I want to start out with a story about my dad. And this happened, I would say, 45 years ago. My dad passed away in 2011. But this happened when I was probably about 25 years or 20 years old. I'm 65 next week, actually. But I was at home visiting from university, and I was in the kitchen preparing some food, and my dad loved to tease me about my interest in health and nutrition because it was not an interest of his for sure. And he had walked by me, sort of sauntered by with this, he stuck his belly out as far as it would go, had a bag of chips and licorice in one hand and a 2-liter bottle of Coke in the other, 2 cigarettes hanging out of his mouth. And he turned to me with this cheeky grin. And I just gave him the look of disgust, of course. But a couple of hours later, I decided I needed to talk to him about this. And I asked him why he was doing this to himself. I said, don't you want to be around for a long time? And he said to me, I think I'd sooner live 50 years doing all the things I love to do, just having the freedom to eat what I want to eat and do what I want to do in life, rather than live 75 years having to restrict this and restrict that. He said, I could get hit by a truck tomorrow. And I responded, I know, Dad, but I don't think it's a reason to walk out in front of one. And the bottom line is, this is what we know. 74% of deaths globally are due to chronic diseases of our own making. An estimated 90% of type 2 diabetes, 80% of heart disease, and 30 to 70% of cancers are considered entirely preventable. And in 2011, the World Health Organization identified the 4 big lifestyle culprits, and they identified them as being smoking, alcohol, physical inactivity, and an unhealthy diet. And they defined an unhealthy diet as one that is based on processed foods with added fat, sugar, and salt, and animal products rich in saturated fats. It's low in high fiber plant foods, such as vegetables, fruits, legumes, whole grains, and nuts. And they went on to add in 2021, in this particular document, Plant-Based Diets and Their Impact on Health, Sustainability, and the Environment, that taken together, the beneficial effects of plant-based diets, including the protection they offer against premature mortality, provides strong evidence for public health guidelines recommending healthful plant-based diets as a means to prevent and control NCDs, or chronic diseases, non-communicable diseases. And the World Health Organization Europe, in their 12 steps to healthy eating, state in step 1, eat a nutritious diet based on a variety of foods originating mainly from plants rather than animals. And national health authorities from around the world are in increasing numbers agreeing with this position. So just to give you a few examples, Brazil says eat foods mainly of plant origin. In Canada, we say healthy eating patterns include mostly plant-based foods. In China, they're telling people to cut meat by 50%. In Denmark, they say eat plant-rich, varied, and not too much. Estonia, eat plant-based, biologically diverse, local, and seasonal. In Germany, choose mostly plant-based foods. Netherlands, eat less meat and more plant-based foods. Qatar, emphasize a plant-based diet. Taiwan, plant-based diets are needed to reach the 2050 net zero target. The UK, eat more plant-based foods. And chronic disease authorities are more and more on this wavelength as well. Cancer organizations like the American Cancer Society states eat a healthy diet with an emphasis on plant foods. The World Cancer Research Fund says eat mostly foods of plant origin. And the American Institute of Cancer Research says choose mostly plant-based plant foods such as vegetables, fruits, and whole grains, and cut sugary drinks. Heart organizations like the American Heart Association says the benefit of plant-based diets are clear. Less risk of disease and improved health and well-being. And the Canadian Heart and Stroke Foundation says a plant-based diet can lower blood pressure, improve cholesterol, help you achieve a healthier weight, and lower your risk of heart disease, stroke, and type 2 diabetes. Type 2 diabetes organizations like the American Diabetes Association says a plant-forward way of eating is associated with improved health outcomes and decreased risk for a variety of chronic diseases. And Diabetes Canada says a plant-based diet is one way that people with type 2 diabetes can maintain good blood glucose levels. And I thought it was really interesting. There was an article in 2022 that did a global analysis of dietary guidelines. And this analysis looked specifically at guidelines for plant-based diets. And nearly half of the 95 guidelines that they looked at actually mentioned plant-based alternatives to meat and milk. And the authors of this paper urged national governments to ensure that food-based dietary guidelines promote sustainable, healthy food choices, and that this includes recommendations to eat fewer animal products and more plant-based foods as part of their positions and their food groups or food guides. Canada was actually cited as an example of the goal, having neither a dedicated dairy nor meat group. And of course, you're familiar with Canada's food guide, which is half the plate being fruits and vegetables, a quarter being whole grains, and a quarter being protein-rich foods, with an emphasis on choosing plant protein choices every single day and making water your drink of choice. Canada's food guide does include dairy in that protein group, but does not have a designated dairy group anymore. And the evidence for plant-based diets is fairly strong. If we look at long-term population studies, there are 3 cohorts that I think are especially interesting because these cohorts look at people that are eating or that are living similar healthy lifestyles, but have different dietary patterns. And they include a North American study called the Adventist Health Study 2, which includes over 96,000 participants. It began in 2002 and is ongoing. The second is Epic Oxford, over 65,000 participants, began in 1993 and is ongoing. And the third actually is 2 cohorts. The Suchi Vegetarian Study, over 12,000 participants, began in 2005, and the Suchi Health Study, over 6,000 participants, and it began in 2007. And if we look at these health-conscious cohorts, the people in these health-conscious cohorts, regardless of their dietary group, diet about 1/3 to 1/2 the rates of the general populations in their regions. And why this is important is because when we compare vegans to omnivores in these studies, we're not comparing vegans to people eating a standard American or Western diet. We're comparing them to people that exercise the same amount, smoke the same amount, drink the same amount, and also consume or choose healthy foods. And so this is really important. It makes the comparison pretty fair. So I just want to show you this quick chart looking at results from a number of the studies from the Adventist Health Study 2 and Epic Oxford. And so here you see the dark red bars are meat eaters, blue bars are lacto-vegetarians, and green bars are vegans. And so for ischemic heart disease, the Epic Oxford study found a 32% lower risk among vegetarians and vegans combined. For hypertension in the Adventist Health Study 2, again, compared to health-conscious meat eaters, the risk was 55% lower among lacto-vegetarians and 75% lower among vegans. For diabetes in the Adventist Health Study 2, it was 38% lower among lacto-ovo and 62% lower among vegans. Cancer in Epic Oxford was 11% lower among lacto-ovo vegetarians, 19% lower among vegans. Diverticular disease in Epic Oxford was 27% lower among lacto-ovo vegetarians and 72% lower among vegans. Kidney disease was 52% lower among vegetarians and vegans combined, and that was in the Adventist Health Study 2. And in Epic Oxford, cataracts were 30% lower in lacto-ovo vegetarians and 40% lower among vegans. Now, there were some negative findings, mainly related to bone health. And so for hip and other bone fractures in Epic Oxford, the risk of hip fractures was 25% higher among vegetarians and 231% higher among vegans. Vegans also had a 43% higher risk of total fractures. Now, the higher risk was actually only observed in vegans with a BMI under 22.5. In other words, fairly thin vegans. The risk was increased in postmenopausal women, but not in men. And in the Adventist Health Study 2, female vegans had a 55% higher risk of hip fracture than non-vegetarians. But those with calcium and vitamin D supplementation did not experience any increase in risk. And there was no association between diet and hip fractures in men in the Adventist Health Study 2. So the authors considered, why would we see this increased risk? And the reasons that were given were, number one, vegans tend to have a lower body mass index. They also have lower calcium intakes, lower vitamin D intakes, lower protein intakes. And in Epic Oxford, they also had less hormone replacement therapy. Now, there's another group of studies that have looked at something called the plant-based diet index. And this is quite interesting. This is, obviously we know that all plant-based diets are not created equal. People can be living on junk food diets, or people can be living on more whole plant-based foods. And there's a big difference in quality of those diets. And so there was a diet quality scoring system developed to examine the relationship between plant-based diets and disease risk, but they also factored in diet quality. So the plant-based diet index is simply meaning a high intake of plant foods, low intake of animal foods. The healthy PDI is a diet index where healthy whole, or diets where healthy whole plant foods predominate. And the UPDI is the unhealthy plant-based diet index. And this is where unhealthy processed plant foods predominate. And there are a number of studies that have looked at the consequences of people eating, higher PDI, higher HPDI, and higher UPDI. And these studies have looked at all kinds of things: all-cause mortality, coronary heart disease, type 2 diabetes, obesity, stroke, colorectal cancer, cognitive dysfunction, erectile dysfunction. And what we see very consistently is the higher the PDI, the lower the risk of, in every single one of these cases. You can see the numbers here. Now, when people were consuming an HPDI, a very healthy plant-based diet index, the numbers were even more impressive. So, for example, for coronary heart disease, it was -8% risk reduction for PDI and a 25% risk reduction for HPDI. And then for the UPDI, in every single case, we saw an increased risk of disease. So this is a big important point here, that we really need to ensure a high quality diet. We have clear, consistent evidence that whole plant foods are associated with reduced risk of chronic disease, and that highly processed foods with added fat, sugar, and salt, fast foods, deep fried foods, and meat, especially red and processed meat, are associated with an increased risk of disease. So why the plant-based advantage? Well, plant-based dietary patterns maximize protective dietary components such as fiber, phytochemicals, antioxidants, plant sterols, and pre- and probiotics. They minimize potentially pathogenic dietary components such as saturated fat, trans fatty acids, refined carbohydrates, Nu-5-GC, which is a pro-inflammatory molecule in meat, TMAO and its precursors, chemical contaminants, pro-oxidants, and endotoxins, which are found mainly in animal products and or highly processed foods. And of course, not only do plant-based diets protect against many chronic diseases, but they provide a safe and powerful treatment option, in some cases even driving disease into remission. And if we look at treatment outcomes with plant-based diets, for cardiovascular disease, we see improved cardiovascular disease risk factors like less hypertension, lower blood cholesterol levels, for example. And as far as I know, plant-based diets are the only diets that have been proven to actually reverse atherosclerosis. Diabetes, we see improved blood lipids and insulin sensitivity. And in motivated patients, we often see remission. And for cancer, we see favorable changes in genetic expression. We see reduced cancer cell growth and decreased DNA damage. So now I want to share a little bit about my own experience putting lifestyle medicine into practice. And I had the privilege of working with groups in two places. One was the Marshall Islands and the other was Lithuania. And the first, the Marshall Islands, for those of you that aren't familiar with the Marshall Islands, they're about halfway between Hawaii and Australia, about 5 to 7 degrees north of the equator. And you can see There's nothing anywhere close to them within a couple thousand miles in any direction. So they're very, very remote. The Marshall Islands declared a state of emergency where type 2 diabetes is concerned. And that's because the Marshallese have among the highest prevalence of type 2 diabetes and the highest death rates from diabetes globally. In 2021, the prevalence was 25.1%, and that was down from over 30% prior to this time. And about half of all surgeries on the islands are actually amputations due to diabetes. So was diabetes a problem in the past? Well, a century ago, diabetes was pretty much unheard of in the Marshall Islands. People were slim, physically active, and they lived off the land. And they consumed essentially whatever they could get, from the ocean. So obviously fish and seafood, and whatever plants grew on the atolls. And so things like coconut, breadfruit, bananas, and certain green leaves like paley leaves, which were edible leaves, were the staples in their diet. Today, people are more sedentary and they eat mostly highly processed foods. And that's because, just for example, the island of Majuro, which is where most of the people reside, there are about 30,000 people there. That island might be able to sustain 500 to 1,000 people. So it just can't sustain everybody that's on the island, so they have to import foods. And people are quite poor, so they can't afford a lot of healthy foods, so they end up consuming a lot of inexpensive processed foods. And you can see this little girl in the left-hand corner. This is 6:30 in the morning, and she's eating, I think, her breakfast, a Pepsi and a popsicle. Lunch is always sticky white rice and some sort of meat. The meal on the upper right is actually a meal that I was given at a funeral. In the lower left, this is a first-year birthday party, and it's just bins of meat and then large portions of rice. The number one drink on the island is called luau. First ingredient in that drink is high fructose corn syrup. And then people consume a lot of inexpensive fatty meat like turkey tails because they're so inexpensive. And I was privileged to be part of a group that went into the Marshall Islands to do a clinical trial. We had 5 overlapping cohorts that were randomized to either an intervention group or a control group. And we put the control group through 3 months of lifestyle medicine, and the control was given usual care. And the 3 months of lifestyle medicine really focused on exercise and a healthy, whole food, plant-based diet, but we also did a lot of education around sleep and stress management and support and addiction control as well. And we spent a lot of time teaching people how to grow food. So a lot of emphasis on that. And our diet was a high fiber diet, 40 grams plus. It was whole food, plant-based, high in phytochemicals and antioxidants, minimal highly processed foods, and it was fairly low in fat. About 20% of the calories and most of that fat came from whole foods like nuts and seeds. And you can see here Dr. John Kelly. He was the founding president of the American College of Lifestyle Medicine, and I were involved in this research. He was the investigator, and I designed and implemented the program. And you can see at 12 weeks, we had a drop in blood glucose of 3.9 millimoles per liter. And at 12 weeks, it was 2.7 millimoles per liter. And that's because the people were preparing more of their food at that stage, their own food at home. We saw an average drop in A1C of about 1.9%, which is pretty impressive, and a drop in CRP, HS, high sensitivity CRP, which is, of course, a measure of inflammation of about 1.2 points. And we saw remission probably in close to a third of our participants. And participants told us they were experiencing less pain, less disability, that they could think more clearly, they had better sleep, and they had a lot less constipation. And then Dr. Kelly and I, you can see here as well, went into Lithuania to do a lifestyle medicine demonstration project. And we had 10 patients, and we did just 10 days of intensive lifestyle medicine. And this picture is of the, to the far left, the head of the lifestyle medicine program, master's program at the university in Vilnius, and one of the medical professors and the head of the School of Public Health, the dean of the School of Public Health, who were all involved. And this was really a demonstration for the medical school and for the government. And in 10 days, we saw drops of 25% plus in cholesterol in our participants. We saw drops in triglycerides of up to 50%, vast improvements in fasting glucose, reduced inflammation, reduced pain in joints. And it really was a huge success and was quite celebrated in the country. And you know, the bottom line to me is we know enough. We know enough to make lifestyle medicine the first-line therapy for individuals with lifestyle-induced chronic diseases. And that brings us to the practical portion of this presentation, 7 steps to an optimal diet for the prevention and treatment of chronic disease. And step number 1 is make whole plant foods the foundation of the diet. And as you can see, this is not a diet of deprivation. This is a diet of absolutely delicious, beautiful food. We want to aim for at least 9 servings or more of vegetables and fruits every day. We want at least 3 servings of legumes, and that doesn't mean 3 bowls of beans. It can include, you know, soups and stews and hummus and soy milk and tempeh and tofu and all kinds, peanut butter. It can include all of these foods. We want to include whole grains, keeping them mostly intact. I'll tell you a little bit more about that as we move forward. But we want to vary our intake with our energy needs. So people that need a lot of calories will need more. People that are restricting energy to lose weight will need a lot less. We want to have at least 1 serving, which is a small handful of nuts and seeds a day. And we want to include sources of essential fatty acids, especially omega-3 fatty acids, in the mix. And then we also want to anoint everything with generous amounts of herbs and spices. And of course, plant foods are the only foods with fiber. And fiber not only promotes regularity, but it builds and maintains a healthy gut microbiome, which supports every body system. It increases satiety, reduces cravings, reduces risk of colorectal cancer, reduces cholesterol levels, stabilizes blood sugar, reduces risk of GI disorder, enhances immune function, and lessens hormonal imbalances. And the recommended intakes in the US and Canada are 14 grams per 1,000 calories, which averages for most men to about 38 grams a day, and for most women, about 25 grams a day. Optimal intakes are thought to be about 40 to 60 grams a day, which is bang on what a person would consume if they're eating a whole food plant-based diet. Actual intakes are about 16 grams a day in the American diet, and somewhere between 15 and 19 grams a day in the Canadian diet. Now, this I think is so interesting. Estimates of Paleolithic intakes range from about 70 to 150 grams of fiber per day. So historically, humans ate a lot of fiber. Step number 2 is to be really picky about your carbohydrates. Carbohydrates, contrary to popular opinion, are not the enemy. Carbohydrates from whole foods are consistently protective to human health. And, you know, one of the things that carbohydrate naysayers tend to forget is that the healthiest foods on the planet, all of these whole plant foods like fruits and vegetables, grains, legumes, contain somewhere between 60 and 90% of calories from carbohydrates, with non-starchy vegetables being at the lower end of the range and fruits being at the higher end of the range. The only plant foods that are low in carbohydrates are nuts and seeds, which have most of their calories coming from healthy fats. Now, animal products are extremely low or completely devoid of carbohydrates. Meat, poultry, and fish. Eggs have a tiny bit. The only animal products that are a little higher in carbohydrates are dairy products. Milk, 2% milk having about 30% of calories from, of course, lactose, the sugar in milk. We all agree, regardless of whether we're low carb or vegan, refined carbohydrates are bad news when it comes to health. Refined carbohydrates increase our risk of overeating and obesity, metabolic associated fatty liver disease, insulin resistance and diabetes, high triglycerides, and heart disease. So what are refined carbohydrates? Well, they are essentially high carbohydrate foods that have been stripped of their nutrients by food processing techniques. So we're talking about refined sugars like table sugars and syrup, jam, jelly, candy, sweetened beverages, and refined starches like white flour products, white rice products, and concentrated starches. The problem is that most of the carbohydrates people eat are refined. And we have an umbrella review, 2023 umbrella review of sugar and health. And in this review actually included over 8,600 articles and 73 meta-analyses. And added sugars were found to have significant harmful associations with 18 endocrine and metabolic outcomes, 10 cardiovascular outcomes, 7 cancer outcomes, and 10 other outcomes. And the authors recommended that we reduce free sugars or added sugars to below 25 grams a day, which is approximately 6 teaspoons a day, and that we should limit consumption of sugar-sweetened beverages to less than 1 serving a week, which is about 1 can of soda per week. And the recommendations for added sugars are similar from the World Health Organization and other health authorities. So the World Health Organization, recommends less than 10% of calories from sugar or from added sugars, or 12 teaspoons in a 2,000 calorie diet. But they actually add that going to less than 5% of calories or 6 teaspoons a day in a 2,000 calorie diet will provide additional health benefit. And the Canadian Heart and Stroke Foundation recommendations are exactly the same. They also recommend less than 5% being ideal. The American Heart Association guidelines are similar, no more than 6% of calories, or 9 teaspoons a day for men, 6 teaspoons a day for women, and no added sugars at all for children under 2, and less than 6 teaspoons a day for children and teens. And so if we look at sugar content of common foods, what we see is for sweet foods like a 12-ounce soda or flavored coffee, a cup of yogurt, or a large cinnamon bun, we're very close to that upper limit of 12 teaspoons a day in one food item. And the 6 teaspoons a day, we're close with foods that we don't even think of as big sugar sources, like energy bars, barbecue sauce, or flavored cereals. And the daily adult intakes of added sugars average about 17 teaspoons a day in the US and about 14 teaspoons a day in Canada. So of course that's a problem. And if you're looking at food labels, a teaspoon of sugar is approximately equal to 4 grams. It's actually 4.2 to be exact. And if we look at the sources of added sugars, I couldn't find the numbers for Canada, but in the US, and Canada is so similar, it's almost half of the added sugars are coming from sweet beverages and over 30% from sweets and snacks. So almost 80% of added sugars are from those 2 categories of foods. And it's a similar story for refined starches. So if we look at refining a grain like wheat, for example, and turning it into white flour. Well, to do that, we're actually removing 2 of the 3 parts of the wheat. We're removing the bran, which of course is where most of the fiber is, and also some of the minerals, and the germ, which is really the nutrient dense core with the bulk of vitamin E and all sorts of other protective nutrients. And in this process, we're losing 80 to 90% of the fiber, 70 to 80% of the vitamins and minerals, and 95% of the protective phytochemicals in that food. And of course, nobody eats a bowl of white flour. Before they eat the white flour, they add fat and sugar and salt and often food additives, and then they eat the white flour. And therein lies the problem. Not only have we removed most of what is of value to human health, but we've added a number of dietary components that we know are associated with increased risk of chronic disease. On the other hand, whole grains are healthy foods. There was a 2016 meta-analysis of 45 studies that reported a reduced risk of mortality for every 3 servings of whole grain intake. And it reduced risk of all-cause mortality 17%, cardiovascular mortality 22%, diabetes mortality 51%, cancer mortality 15%, and respiratory disease mortality 22%. But one thing that we do need to be aware of is all whole grains are not created equal. A granola bar does not equal a bowl of oatmeal, and a box of Kamut flakes does not equal, a Kamut berry salad, for example. We need to consider the level of food processing that is done to that whole grain. So I actually developed something called the whole grain hierarchy to help people understand this concept. Intact whole grains are basically grains that almost as they're picked off the plant, there's nothing harmful added, there's nothing healthful taken away. They take a long time to digest because they're in such a whole form. And then we see cut whole grains like steel cut oats, then rolled like rolled oats, then shredded like shredded wheat, then ground whole grains like whole wheat flour products, then flaked whole grains like cold flaked cereals, then puffed whole grains like puffed wheat. And as we go down this list, we're increasing the surface area of the food. We're increasing the rate at which it will be absorbed into the bloodstream and the glycemic impact. We're also increasing the degree of processing, the exposure of the grain to heat and light and oxygen and pressure. And in those processes, we're reducing some of the nutritional value. So if we're trying to prevent or reverse disease, we want to stick to the top half of the hierarchy most of the time. So carbohydrate common sense, we want to get carbohydrates from high fiber whole plant foods. We want to avoid added sugars, especially in beverages. Drink water instead. We want to minimize all refined carbohydrates, both starches and sugar. Step number 4, or is this step number 3? Anyway, pick plant protein sources instead of meat. And the reason being that food components that have a positive impact on health, like fiber and phytochemicals, are either high or very high in legumes, and they're either absent or very low in meat. Food components that are associated with increased risk of disease, like saturated fat and trans fatty acids, are either low or zero in legumes and are moderate to high in meat. And if we look at we have studies on legumes and mortality versus meat and mortality. We see very consistently reduced risk of chronic disease with legumes. So for legumes and mortality, a 2023 meta-analysis of 32 cohorts with over 1 million participants reported a 6% drop in mortality for every 50 grams or about quarter cup serving of legumes. And another study of people 70 plus reported a 7 to 8% reduction in mortality for every 20 grams, about 2 tablespoons of legumes consumed. Based on this study, if we did the math, eating a cup of beans or 170 grams would reduce mortality by 60 to 68%. And red and processed meat and mortality, we see the exact opposite. We have a 2023 umbrella review of 40 meta-analysis that showed high consumption of red and processed meat was associated with higher all-cause mortality and chronic disease. And for every additional 100 gram or 3.5 ounce serving of red meat, we saw a 17% increased risk of type 2 diabetes, 15% increased risk of coronary heart disease, 14% increased risk of hypertension, and 12% increased risk of stroke. And for every additional 50 grams or 1.75 ounces of processed meat, a 37% increased risk of type 2 diabetes, 27% increased risk of coronary heart disease, 17% increased risk of stroke, and 15% increased risk of all-cause mortality. And we can look even more specifically at the impact of specific types of animal products. And just, one of the first studies that did this was a study of over 130,000 participants followed for about 3 decades. And they looked at the reduction in risk of death when just 3% of calories from animal protein sources were replaced with plant protein sources. So 3% of calories in a 2,000 calorie diet is 60 calories. That's less than the calories of 1 egg. It's about the number of calories of 1 to 1.5 ounces of meat. So if what we are replacing is processed red meat, the risk reduction was 34%. For 3% of calories or 60 calories. For eggs, 19%, for unprocessed meat, 12%, for dairy, 8%, and for poultry or fish, 6%. And then in 2020, there was an NIH study, National Institutes of Health, over 400,000 participants followed for 16 years. They looked at the very same metric, 3% of calories from animal protein being replaced with plant protein. And they found that it reduced overall mortality by 10%. If what we were replacing was eggs, it was over 20% risk reduction, 13% risk reduction for men, 15% risk reduction for women when it was red meat, 8% for dairy, and 2% for men, 5% for women when it was white meat. And then there was another study that looked at high protein and mortality. And this is over 6,000 participants followed for about 18 years. And for people who were eating more than 20% of calories from protein who were 50 to 65 years of age, mortality increased 75%, and there was a 4-fold increased risk of cancer and diabetes mortality. And what's really interesting is the associations were abolished or greatly attenuated when the protein came from plants. So these numbers were only really valid when the protein came from animal products. Now, it's interesting to note the same study found that protein was more protective for people who were over 66 years of age. So in older adults, those who were eating at least 10% of calories from protein had lower risk than those who were eating less than 10% of calories from protein. Those with less than 10% of calories from protein had a higher risk of overall and cancer mortality, although their diabetes mortality was still lower. In older adults, the authors concluded that higher protein intakes, at least 10% of calories from protein, may be necessary to reduce age-dependent weight loss, sarcopenia, frailty, and excessive loss of IGF-1. So what are the healthiest plant protein sources? No question, unprocessed or minimally processed legumes, like cooked legumes, sprouted peas or lentils, edamame, tofu, tempeh, peanuts, peanut butter, unprocessed or minimally processed nuts or seeds, intact whole grains like amaranth, quinoa, or kamut berries, and fresh peas. Step number 4, so that was step 3. I don't know why I had step 4 twice. Reduce total fat and replace harmful sources of fat with more healthful sources. So what are the most healthful sources? Well, they are whole plant foods, because whole plant foods provide mostly unsaturated fat, including essential fatty acids, and provide a myriad of protective dietary components like fiber and phytochemicals. By contrast, concentrated fats and oils are more calorically dense, and they have they have lower nutrient density, they have few nutrients, and of course they have no fiber. So we want to limit our intake of those particular fat sources. We definitely want to cut back on saturated fat. The American Heart Association recommends no more than 5 to 6% of calories from saturated fat for heart disease risk reduction. And 5 to 6% of calories in a 2,000 calorie diet is less than 16 grams. And if we look at the amount of saturated fat in various foods, we can see that a number of animal products, 2 slices of meat lovers pizza, a double cheeseburger, a soft taco with beef and cheese are all 16 plus grams of saturated fat. That's one meal, really. 1 cup of whole milk and 2 ounces of cheese would also get you above that 16 grams. By contrast, high fat plant foods are actually pretty low, generally pretty low in saturated fat, providing about 0.6 to 2 grams per serving of food. The only exception is tropical oils and foods that are rich sources of tropical oils, like coconut. We want to minimize our exposure to damaged fats. We want to basically avoid fried or highly processed foods, minimize oils used in cooking, and if used, we should not allow the oils to smoke. And we want to store high-fat foods, including shelled nuts and seeds, in the refrigerator or freezer to preserve their fats, the quality of their fats. We want to optimize omega-3 fatty acids. We want to ensure sufficient alpha-linolenic acid, and the acceptable intake is 1.1 grams for females and 1.6 grams for males. And I would recommend doubling that for those that don't get any direct sources of EPA and DHA. And so how much omega-3 do we get from omega-3 rich plant foods? Well, we get about 2.6 grams in an ounce of walnuts, 1.8 in a tablespoon of chia seeds, 1.6 in a tablespoon of ground flax seeds, and 1 in a tablespoon of hemp seeds. Now, we will also want to consider microalgae supplements, because EPA and DHA, of course, in the omnivorous population will come mainly from fish. But for those that don't consume fish, we can get EPA and DHA from microalgae that produces EPA and DHA. And it may be very well advised for those with increased needs, like pregnant and lactating women, and those that don't convert plant omega-3s to the long-chain omega-3s very efficiently, like older adults and people with chronic disease. Some people would argue we should probably be consuming EPA and DHA for everyone, and this is still a point of contention. I think it's not a bad idea. Generally, adults need about 200 to 500 milligrams per day. Some people may need more. Step 5 is to maximize phytochemicals and antioxidants. And phytochemicals and antioxidants may protect against disease and enhance dietary treatment. And they can do this by helping to reduce oxidative stress and inflammation, enhance gut microbiota, improve fasting glucose and insulin sensitivity, and support immune function, and protect against DNA damage as well. So the most phytochemical and antioxidant-rich foods are whole plant foods, like vegetables, fruits, legumes, grains, nuts, and seeds, and also herbs and spices, sprouts, fermented foods, and antioxidant-rich teas like green teas and herbal teas. And of course, the wider the range of vegetables, fruits, legumes, whole grains, nuts, and seeds in the diet, the greater the variety and content of phytochemicals and antioxidants. We want to go for color. So the richest sources are often the most colorful. To maximize protective phytochemicals and antioxidants, we may want to choose purple instead of white onions, black instead of brown rice, and dark instead of light greens more often, just to give you some examples of the kinds of colorful foods we can choose. The other thing I like to do is to really make an effort to get the entire rainbow reflected in my salads and my stir fries and in, my meals generally. And I aim for each day at least 3 green, 2 orange, yellow, 2 pink, red, and 1 purple, blue, and 1 white, beige food. And we want to eat more raw foods. So raw foods contain enzymes that convert phytochemicals into their active forms. And I have 2 examples here. Myrosinase in cruciferous vegetables helps to convert glucosinolates into isothiocyanates. And the allanase in allium vegetables helps to convert allan to the more active form allicin. And we may want to consider to start sprouting foods more often or to buy sprouts. The phytochemical army poised to protect new plants when they're growing multiplies often by about 5 to 50 times in sprouts. We want to pile on the herbs and spices because these are some of our most concentrated sources of phytochemicals and antioxidants per gram of food. We want to drink antioxidant-rich teas and eat whole plant foods and minimize highly processed foods. And step 6, we want to minimize dietary contaminants. And here we're talking about environmental contaminants and the byproducts of high temperature cooking. And these things can do some damage. They can increase oxidative stress, fuel inflammation, disrupt hormones, damage vital organs, including beta cells, damage DNA in the central nervous system. And so what we're talking about is environmental contaminants like pesticides in conventional produce, heavy metals like mercury in fish and seafood, and arsenic in rice, chicken, fish, and seaweed. And of course, persistent organic pollutants like PCBs, DDT, and dioxin in animal products, because these things tend to move up the food chain. So solutions here are very simple. Eat lower on the food chain. Choose organic foods if you can and more often. And vary your grains. Instead of just eating rice, eat a wider variety of grains, for example. Inorganic arsenic can increase the risk of type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease, and rice tends to be one of the more concentrated sources in the food supply. So to reduce arsenic in rice without losing too many nutrients, we can boil the rice for about 5 minutes in a large amount of water, at least 4 to 6 times more water than rice. Drain it and then proceed with usual cooking. And then products of high temperature cooking. Here we're talking about things like heterocyclic amines, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, acrylamide, and advanced glycation end products. And I thought this study was interesting. I'm not sure how much weight to put on it, but it was just interesting. A brand new 2023 study reported that high temperature cooking can damage the DNA of food. And when this damaged DNA is absorbed into the bloodstream, it may actually have a negative impact on the DNA of the consumer. And the DNA damage appeared most pronounced from meat, which has a high DNA content compared to plant foods. So if we look at the sources of these products of high temperature cooking, heterocyclic amines are formed only in animal products because creatine or creatinine are required for the formation of this compound. And so grilled and other meats prepared in high temperatures, dry heat, will form the greatest amounts of heterocyclic amines. And then polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons are formed in any foods that are blackened, including plant products. Acrylamide is formed in a variety of foods, but the most concentrated source is actually fried potato products because they're high in the amino acid asparagine, which is needed for the formation of acrylamide. And then finally, advanced glycation end products are most concentrated in processed meat that are cooked with dry heat. Solutions here: avoid charred or blackened foods, especially meat, poultry, or fish. Avoid deep fried foods, and use more moist cooking methods. Moist cooking methods like steaming, stewing, boiling water, sauteing, all produce fewer products of oxidation. And finally, step 7 is to meet needs for all essential nutrients without overeating. And that includes macronutrients like protein, carbohydrate, and fat, and micronutrients such as vitamins and minerals. And it's interesting to note, of course, we need to ensure adequate nutrients of all essential nutrients. And it's interesting to note that plant-based eaters tend to have higher intakes than omnivores of folate, vitamin C, K, and E, iron, potassium, magnesium, and copper. Now, iron absorption, however, is lower in plant-based diets. So even though consumption, the number of milligrams consumed by people eating a fully plant-based diet tends to be higher, this is a nutrient that sometimes does need attention on plant-based diets because it's less well absorbed. But nutrients that may fall short on plant-based diets are vitamin B12, calcium, vitamin D, iodine, zinc, choline, and omega-3 fatty acids. And we want to make sure that the diet is designed to provide reliable sources. And that's one of the reasons I've been involved in creating these food guides. This is called the Plant-Based Plate, and it's from the book Nourish, which I co-authored with a pediatrician, Dr. Reshma Shah. And if you follow the guide and include the add-ons that may not be consumed, if you just consume foods on the plate, you will be pretty much assured nutritional adequacy. And you can also use the guide from Plant-Powered Protein and Becoming Vegan, which is called the Vegan Plate. Take-home message of this presentation is that well-designed whole food plant-based diets provide a powerful and effective means of preventing and treating lifestyle-related chronic diseases. The good news is that, The good news is that the power of plant-based diets extends far beyond ourselves. Plant-based diets are the most ecologically sustainable diets. And I really believe that there's probably no greater step that any one individual human being can take towards the preservation of this planet than shifting to a plant-based diet. And there was a study from 2023 that compared the carbon footprint of popular diets. And you can see the vegan diet has the very lowest carbon footprint. And compared to vegan diets, the carbon footprint is 4.2 times greater for keto diets, 3.8 times higher for paleo diets, and 3.2 times greater for omnivorous diets. And the reason being is being very simple, that animal-based foods produce more greenhouse gas emissions. And this is looking at kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalents per kilogram of food. And you can see in animal products, the range is between 4.5 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalents per kilogram, up to 60 for beef. And if you look at the numbers for plant foods, they tend to be, in the range of 0.2 to, 1.4 for most plant-based foods. And of course, plant-based eating is, I think, more ethically justifiable as well. We slaughter over 200 million land animals for food every single day on this planet. That's over 70 billion per year, and over 90% of those animals are raised in CAFOs. To me, it makes little sense to cause pain, suffering, and death in other living beings when it's not only unnecessary, but it increases the risk of death and disease in people, and it threatens the very life support systems of our planet. By getting our nutrition from plants, we all win. And we have a choice. And when we consider the consequences of our food choices, both for ourselves and beyond ourselves, a plant-based diet becomes both an ecological and ethical imperative. And I'd like to conclude this presentation by telling you the rest of the story about my dad. Probably about 2 or 3 years after that interaction, my dad had a stroke while he was at work. And I'll never forget when he went to the hospital, his blood pressure was 220 over 110, and his blood glucose was over 28 millimoles per liter. And I'll never forget his doctor telling him if he didn't stop smoking, he'd probably live about 3 months. And if he did, he might live 3 years. And my dad and I, we were sitting on his bed, and we both had tears coming down our cheeks. And my dad said to me, he said, "What was I thinking?" He said, I don't want to die. He said, I want to see my grandchildren grow up. I want to dance with my sweetheart at our 50th anniversary. And I think it was at this point that my dad actually got that without health, there is no freedom. And it was at this point that he decided to make some changes. And he never made the changes to the extent that I wished he would have. But he did start exercising and eating oatmeal and blueberries for breakfast instead of bacon and eggs. And I'm really happy to say he lived another 25 years after, and shocked his doctors by doing so. And he danced with his sweetheart at their 50th wedding anniversary. And with that, these are some of the books, my latest plant-powered protein that I've done, and I thank you very much for your attention. And I will stop my share and be very happy to take any questions that you might have.
Brenda, thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation. A little bit of tears coming to the eyes when we heard that your father did make it to the 50th anniversary. That is phenomenal. I really appreciated everything that you said there, and definitely resonated at so many levels: health, environment, and suffering.
Thank you.
So we actually have some questions from our audience. So I'll give them to you. And thank you very much for going overtime for this. And for those of you that are still streaming us live, thank you as well for offering us some extra time to make up for the time we lost at the beginning. You mentioned a lot of different diseases, chronic diseases that can be addressed with plant-based eating. And so Suzanne asked, what about RA, which I presume is rheumatoid arthritis, and autoimmune disease? Is there any evidence that plant-based foods can help with that?
Absolutely. So rheumatoid arthritis, there are actually a number of studies that have looked at what happens. There were some older studies that looked at using raw food diets. There have been some other studies as well. But generally, because the diet is so anti-inflammatory, it does tend to reduce inflammation in the joints and reduces symptoms of arthritis. Now, there are some specific programs that have been designed to help people create a diet that really works. But of course, you have to also take into consideration the possibility of food sensitivities. And if you're consuming foods that you're sensitive to, that can impact the integrity of your gut, and you can get intact proteins leaking into the bloodstream, and it can cause some increased inflammation. So that's something just to really rule out food sensitivities as well. And there are a number of people that have been working with autoimmune diseases, and the same applies to that. But certainly, I think often of Brooke Goldner, who has a book called Goodbye Lupus, who had stage 4 lupus when she was quite young. And she became a physician and completely reversed her lupus using a plant-based diet. Started out sort of by mistake doing a kind of a weight loss thing and finding some benefits, and then jumped in the deep end and had remarkable results. So there definitely are some people out there that have been working with autoimmune diseases as well.
And if I can just add my own experience, a friend of mine suffered severely from arthritis. In fact, she had a bucket list because she felt by 50 she'd probably be in a wheelchair. And then she read the China study and went 3 months, tried a plant-based diet, and has drastically reduced the pain and suffering she has from her arthritis. And hey, she's still rock climbing, and she's now 55, so it's worked out very well for her.
Oh, that's a wonderful story.
Yeah. Yeah. So what are your thoughts from the healthfulness of plant-based meal replacements? Like you talked about processed foods, and the one that's mentioned here is spelled HUEL. Quill? I personally don't know what that is.
So I'm not familiar with it either, but is it a powder that's mixed with water that replaces a meal like a like a full meal replacement? That's what I'm guessing it is. That it's a liquid meal, and generally, liquid meals can be helpful for weight reduction, because for some people, when they have these very specific items and they don't get tempted by all the foods that tend to tempt us, it's just easier for them. I wouldn't do it 3 times a day. I might do it for one meal at most, unless you're doing a very, very intensive program and you're being supervised. But you need the fiber, you need all of the protective components from whole foods as much as possible. And I think part of developing a healthier way of eating is being able to manage the whole foods. And so it can be a tool, but I would say you definitely want to graduate to completely full meals with whole foods.
And you're quite right. I did look it up while you were chatting, while you were answering the question. And it is a daily superfood blend with whole source ingredients, antioxidants, and plant-based protein. How much fiber it has, I would have to look further in to see that.
And generally, when fiber is blended like that, it has very different impact on the body than when it's in larger chunks. And so there'll be, it's not the same as eating whole food.
Okay. But it's not as bad as a true processed food, which...
No, absolutely. Especially if it's whole food based, it may have some utility for some people.
Okay. Thank you for that. Little bit of an opinion asked here. Why are healthy foods more expensive? I mean, you go to the supermarket and you can buy your wonderful hot dogs with who knows what in them fairly inexpensively, but healthy foods, fresh fruit and vegetables tend to be more expensive. Do you have any insight or thought on that?
Well, one of the things that I would say is the poorest people on the planet eat plant-based because they can't afford animal products. So animal products are quite expensive. When you look at beans, lentils, whole grains, those staples tend to be fairly inexpensive, especially if you buy them in bulk. And then it's the fruits and vegetables, nuts and seeds that are a little more costly. And so we found in the Marshall Islands, one of the things that we would recommend is to really rely a lot on some of the less expensive produce, so cabbage and onions and carrots, and also really shopping around. When I lived in Kelowna for years, we used to go directly to the farms, and we would get grapes for 50 cents a pound, and apples for 50 cents a pound, and it was wonderful. So if you have more direct access to the food, if you can grow some of your own food, it can be very helpful. I grow, food during the summer months, of course, but in the winter months, I'm always growing sprouts. Sprouts are expensive in the grocery store. They cost almost nothing to grow on your kitchen counter, and they're very easy to grow. So there are ways of working around it, really relying on those staples. Buying legumes in their dried form, preparing them from scratch, really can help reduce the total food cost. Those are the least expensive foods of all.
I'm a big dried legume person, and I will just say, if anybody out there's wondering about them, they take a little bit of planning because you soak them and you cook them, but they're not a lot of work, just a bit of planning.
Exactly. And I mean, soaking them, what do? Pour a little water on, let them soak overnight. It's no big deal. If you have an instant pot, it makes them, just quick and easy to cook. And that's kind of fun to do. You don't need one, but certainly it can be helpful too.
So you mentioned right at the beginning, you mentioned the food, you mentioned guides, national guides, the Canada Food Guide as well. It's quite impressive right now in how it's put together. In 2019, all science-based, no lobbies, no lobbies involved in putting it together. However, we're not really embracing it as much as we should, and certainly hospitals and schools in Canada. I don't know if they actually do in general offer plant-based options. I'll say my last time in emergency, I was offered a peanut butter sandwich as my plant-based option here at Lionsgate in North Vancouver. And any insight as to why we don't have government hospitals that are maxing out on staffing, and even schools to help kids? Why aren't we embracing this more?
I am 100% with you on this. We need to get this operationalized in our institutions, and we've really. I was actually just talking to Visanto, my writing partner, and we were saying we need to make this our next project, to really put some pressure on so that hospitals are offering healthy plant-based options. And we're seeing this happen in the States, in New York especially, and there are places around the world that are doing this. I will never forget being in Taiwan at the Tzu Chi hospitals. All of their food is plant-based. It's completely plant-based, and their cafeteria is 100% plant-based. And I shouldn't say that. There may be a little bit of egg. I'm not sure, but it's definitely vegetarian, if not completely vegan. And I remember going into their kitchen. I was being given a tour, and the first thing I saw was these giant garbage bags that were filled with organic green, just filled with organic greens. And I looked at the person giving me the tour. I said, "What's that?" And they said, "Well, now, those are all the organic greens that the nuns just picked from the gardens this morning." They said that is the most important food for our patients. They need to get a lot of greens so they can heal. And that's why we feed them plant-based foods. And I thought, this was 2008. It was 2008. So, I mean, we just have a long way to go to get there. And I think that, having Canada's food guide should be a great tool for helping us to put some pressure on to see some change in that regard. It's time. It's beyond time.
Oh, it's beyond time. So we're at 5:30. So we're just going to, I want to say thank you, Brenda, for your wonderful presentation and your openness to answering all these questions, and for staying an extra half hour in doing that when we had technical difficulties at the beginning. Thank you to all the people that stayed while we were live streaming. And we will see you at our next EarthSave Canada speaker series with Dr. Jan Hayek. Brenda, thank you, and have a wonderful rest of the day.
Oh, thank you so much, Carrie. Thank you for having me, and thank you for hosting. And I look forward to the next one as well.
Bye.